So in 2017, Glen Aikenhead wrote an article called Enhancing School Mathematics Culturally, a Pathway of Reconciliation. I'm going to talk about, just fair warning that I will talk about the 215 children that went to residential school and never went back home. I wanted to implement this in a way of how do we move forward from here and incorporating this into how does this knowledge and understanding and compassion move forward into a form of curriculum in the Ministry of Education's eyes. So this is a really good article written by Glen where he's talking about how to implement Indigenous worldviews into curriculum. So he begins with many mathematic educators unknowingly embrace problematic, taken for granted notions about their school subject that inhibit student engagement and contribute to Indigenous students' low graduation rates. And so it's one of my, since I've been working for School District 70 and we've been working at the Indigenous graduate rates, what is working and what isn't working, and how are we incorporating Indigenous worldview. And I want to say Indigenous worldview in an avenue where we're not talking about one nation of Indigenous people. So he talks about these changes coincide with another profound transformation taking place in countries with Indigenous citizens in response to having kidnapped Indigenous children and held them in residential schools in an attempt to rid them of their Indigenous self-identities. Canada's federal government apologized in 2008 and established a process of reconciliation. Respect is more than tolerance and inclusion. It requires dialogue and collaboration. In many countries with Indigenous citizens, an increasing number of mathematics educators and Ministry of Education understand the merits of enhancing school mathematics with the Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, living, and being, Indigenous perspectives. So the strategies that we want to understand is Indigenous with a capital I. Indigenous with a capital I is understanding the fact that Indigenous people consist of First Nations people, Inuit and Métis people. And this is like not just one band. This is not one tribe. Indigenous as in all across Canada to prevent the whole pan-Indian thing that's happened in the past. The strategy has increased that students' mastery of science and math concepts, deeper levels of student engagement in science and math, and increased student achievement in math and science. Since I've been an Indigenous educator in the education system in School District 70, one of our biggest faults or flaws is that students come to grade 8, grade 9, grade 10 with the lowest completing grade rates. So some of them will like get passed on with like a 3 or 4%, and then they'll just get passed forward anyways. Notably, cultural perspectives and identities within identifiable Indigenous groups are far from homogeneous. By referring to a group's singular name, I do not suggest that the group is homogeneous, even though the group may embrace some fundamental ideas unanimously. So even though we may, as First Nations people, have the same teachings as Métis or the Inuit people, it does not mean that we come from the same race. There are multiple layers of Indigenous people across Canada. This colonial initiated imbalance inevitably favors the non-Indigenous researchers or teachers accordingly. This political social issue pervades this article's text, subtext. Mathematics educators who are unaware of or ignore this political social imbalance will tend to blind their privileged positions in society and thus blind some important interpersonal dynamics with Indigenous adults and students. So, how do you unravel this? By looking at one's privilege. A math and science teacher often has really wanted to teach those courses because they have a real profound love, passion, and desire for math or science. They don't just accidentally fall into it, they actually pursue it. They feel really deeply about it. For example, if a researcher or teacher subscribes to the popular notion that Indigenous students have lost their culture, the researcher or teachers implicitly blame the Indigenous community for the loss, being reckless caretakers of their culture. So I thought that was a little bit of a sharp note. And then it says, however, if a privileged savvy educator, i.e., person politically or socially informed in terms of privilege blindness, subscribes to the notion of European colonizers almost obliterated the students' indigenous culture, then the blame of the colonizers' shoulders for the students losing facets of their own culture. This important shift of the emphasis on blaming indigenous groups to the blaming of the colonizer pivoted around a critical analysis of the word lost. Lost issues include contemporary consequences of colonization, privilege blindness, the mathematics curriculums, and the high status of school mathematics, a cultural-based alienation of students. So I felt like it was a little bit of a sharp note too, because you see a lot of I don't like using the word colonizer. Like, I honestly don't like the word colonizer, even though it's been colonization and white people and all of that, because I feel like I try to come from a place of inclusion, and that only furthers or segregates or perpetuates that dynamic of us and them. Issues include contemporary consequences of colonization, privilege, blindness, and the mathematics curriculum, the high status of school mathematics, cultural-based alienation of students. So students often come into grade 8, grade 9, grade 10 feeling really alienated because they didn't really teach science and math in a way that I find the education system wants to teach an Indigenous student how to do math and science in this bubble that works for everybody else. But does it really work for everybody else, is what I'm trying to say. People may just stuff that food down and never digest it because it just keeps on coming. And they come to this place where they're just programming the information for tests and whatever else. So that really doesn't work either. But they just found a way inside of themselves to just keep on compacting the information and putting it away. First Nations population in Western Canada plummeted in the 19th century due to the engineered epidemics of orchestrated starvation. The federal government stole from their families for long periods of time, forced the children into residential schools. The policy behind the government-funded church-run school systems attempted to kill the Indian and the child. The mortality rate of the children in Western Canadian residential schools was known to be about 30 to 50% in 1910. Ottawa's Department of Indian Affairs dismissed this data thusly. This alone does not justify in the policy of the department, which is geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem, quoted King in 2012. Atrocious conditions prevented children from learning how to be loving parents. Later, when they had children, their cruel parenting skills learned at residential schools tore apart traditionally strong family units on the reserves. Intergenerational dysfunction followed, often unabated. What does that mean? Holy smokes, that's a really huge topic. So we're sitting there and we're thinking, let's just send homework home with these kids so they can go home and do their homework because they didn't do their homework in the classroom. It's not going to work. I can tell you that I was not doing my homework with my kid. Even though I'm an educator, I was not doing my homework with my kid because I didn't know how. I didn't even know how to parent my kids. And my son is 16 years old, and I'm finally figuring that out. My oldest son is 21 years old, and I'm finally figuring out how to freaking love them, because residential schools tore that apart from me. So since then, the government discriminatory policies toward Indigenous people continued even more covertly, thus provoking an enormous accumulation of negative consequences. For example, the reserve schools are currently funded by 60% of non-Indigenous schools are given per pupil. Could you imagine that? That they're having an education system on the reserve with 60% of the money that a regular education system gets. And they're supposed to be successful. There was a lot more in this article that I found really thought-provoking, and I felt like I wanted to just kind of blaze through a whole bunch of the information that they put in there. The actual book that it comes from is a really big book. It took me several hours to actually read the whole entire thing. But I just wanted to bring those thoughts to the top of your brain, because we're sitting here in Canada trying to figure out how to make this education system work for a community or a society that has no idea or comprehension or understanding, even empathy towards Indigenous students. Has been a lot of hard work. We are in 2021, and all of a sudden there's all this comprehension and understanding of how much trauma, how much devastation an Indigenous student has gone through. So I just wanted to bring this up as a form of, well, this is a new way that we're going to have to figure out how to teach the students and have disengaged students learn, or figure out how to teach a disengaged student. Thank you very much.